Hey book readers, it's monthly rewind time. I took a quick vacation to Mexico City this month, so I got a lot of reading done, but that also meant that I paid the price with salsa stains on pages and guacamole smears on Kindle covers. Anyway, it's time to say adios to July with a review of the novels I enjoyed or didn't this month. First up is Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. I finally got around to reading this high fantasy classic that many of y'all have probably already read. I expected it to be great, and it was. The book's main character is Fitz Chivalry, the bastard of a prince. Fitz discovers he has magical abilities and has to figure out how to be of service to the king without overextending himself and getting murdered for the threat his royal blood poses. So he starts studying to become an assassin for the king. It's a tough job, but someone with the right background and disposability has to do it. What's great about Assassin's Apprentice is the slow reveal of magic, the politics, the characters, and the history of this world. It's similar to a Game of Thrones in a lot of ways. Not as action-packed necessarily, but otherwise the pacing is pretty comparable. And I like this steady build of the relationships between Fitz and the other characters. And it kind of brings into question, like, are they friends? Are they enemies? Are they frenemies? Some of these relationships are pretty obvious from the get-go, but others take time to settle into the power dynamics. Hobb gives the reader time to wrap our heads around why this character is kind to Fitz, or is cruel to Fitz, or kind of a mixture of both. And this was definitely a 5-star read for me. And it's probably, though, the most unexcited I've ever been about a 5-star book. And I think that's because everyone told me I'd like it, I thought I'd like it, and I did like it. There was no drama or surprise in my enjoyment of it. If fantasy is your thing and you haven't cracked this one open yet, be sure to do so at some point, please. I'm looking forward to reading the next book in this series at some point as well. The second book I read this month was A Closed and Common Orbit by Becky Chambers. Now this was unexpected, and not in its quality, of course, but in its content. Since it's book number 2 in the Wayfarer series, I thought it would pick right back up where the first one left off, with the same cast of characters that I fell in love with from the first book. The sequel follows the thread of one storyline from the first book, digging deep into 2 side characters from The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet. Now, after I got over the shock of realizing this wasn't the book I signed up to read, I was blown away. This book was amazing. 5 stars for sure. There was a past and present framing, which follows the story of Sidra, the second iteration of the AI character Lovelace, who basically rebooted after the first book, and it gives this AI character a new conscience. And she's been taken in by Pepper, who also shows up in the first book. And Pepper is a genius engineer who's helping Sidra learn the ins and outs of her new body, as well as how to pass herself off as human. The second, and in my opinion, best part of this book is when it dives into Pepper's backstory. It's heartbreaking and unputdownable as Pepper grows from a girl into a woman in a lonely, harsh environment. I won't say more other than that, really, but it's a touching story about humanity and survival. And what's kind of cool about this is, honestly, you don't need to read the first book in the series to pick this one up. So if its plot is more appealing to you than the first book in the series sounds like, I'd say just go for it and read A Closed and Common Orbit first. You won't regret it. The third book I read this month was The Black Cloud by Fred Hoyle. You can tell that this book was written by a hardcore scientist/astronomer. The premise for this hard sci-fi novel is that astronomers discover a huge dark cloud of gas that's heading straight for the sun and then for Earth. More bad news, it's going to block out the sun for at least a month. So the fictional astronomers and scientists in this book have to start solving problems like, should we be worried about the cloud's radiation? Can we survive in subs on top of ice or underwater or in caves underground? And how will we communicate with other nations when this happens? It's a fascinating brainstorming session that shows the different ways a catastrophic global event could really hose us. And it's so much better because the book is set in like the 1950s or 60s, so they can't rely on computer calculations or simulations. It's like watching a movie set in a time before smartphones where the characters have to be extra ingenious in how they solve the problems. And this book lays out the apocalypse with unflinching honesty as millions of people in the book die to heat, floods, hurricanes, and cold temperatures. One passage says, I wrote this down, between the beginning of August and the first week of October, roughly a quarter of the world's population died. And then it just moves on because the book has bigger fish to fry, namely trying to figure out exactly what the black cloud is. And I gave this sci-fi book 4 stars. This was a pessimistic view of the future of our planet and the perils of first contact. It's really about understanding how we're just tiny, silly humans in a massive universe. And if hard sci-fi is your thing, don't miss this one. Next up is The Cat Who Saved Books by Sosuke Natsukawa. Rintaro's grandfather has died, leaving a bookshop to Rintaro. But Rintaro is a hikikomori, I think that's how you pronounce it, a person who isolates themselves socially. He's like a shut-in. And he's still in high school, so he may need to move away and live with an aunt. Then Tiger the Tabby, a no-nonsense talking cat, shows up saying that he needs Rintaro's help in rescuing books. Rintaro reluctantly agrees, and the cat transports him to some kind of parallel world where Rintaro begins his quest. He first has to reason with 3 different kinds of book people: an imprisoner of books, a mutilator of books, and a seller of books. My favorite was probably the mutilator of books, who chops up novels, whittling each of them down to a short synopsis. It's like reading a plot from a Wikipedia article. And he does this because people nowadays are in a hurry and don't have time to read. So the mutilator says that a short summary is really the only way to appeal to people and keep the book alive. And I gave 4 stars to this one as well. It's a book that's kind of like a video game in a lot of ways. Rintaro has to defeat 4 bosses and rescue a special friend in order to ultimately win in the end. I also enjoyed the parts with the bookseller, who's one of these main bad guys. And he only stocks popular books that sell, claiming that those are the only ones that bookshops should have available. Overall, the novel looks at the purpose of reading, rereading, and selling and buying books. It's a light but thought-provoking read that speaks to book lovers, bookshop owners, and all kinds of literary folks. Another book I read this month was The Heart in Winter by Kevin Barry. Set in 1890s Montana, this is a light western with a splash of romance. Tom Rourke is the main character. He's a strange ballad maker who likes drinking and smoking. And while working part-time as a photographer's assistant, he meets Polly Gillespie. She's new in town, recently arrived for the sole purpose of marrying a religious businessman in the town. Well, the sparks between Tom and Polly fly, and the two are soon running away together to San Francisco on horseback. Now, like I said, Tom is kind of strange, and he's not the most proficient cowboy. He doesn't ride well, he doesn't fight well, and he really hasn't planned this whole fugitive thing out. While a couple of hired gunmen track down these star-crossed lovers, Tom and Polly enjoy this brief, blissful romance. At one point, like just resting, relaxing, luxuriating in a fully stocked cabin for more than a week. And this was another 4-star read. What stands out to me about this book was the way it's written. There's a unique writing style, cadence, and even vocabulary that takes a little getting used to, especially like the beginning of the novel. It took me a few pages to really understand what I was reading. Like there aren't any quotation marks, and the text kind of just flows together at points. And that's not a negative thing, though. It's also got lighthearted moments sprinkled in it. Blink and you might miss them, since a couple of the characters have a quick wit or a unique way with words. In the end, it's a fun Western romp with a poetic feel, making the story seem grander than it should. Next up was a nonfiction book, which was Supercommunicators by Charles Duhigg. I like reading books about connecting with other people and talking good. And as you can tell, it's working real good. Anyway, the book here provides tips on how to become a supercommunicator. And that's someone who can guide conversations to create meaningful connections, deeper discussions, and successful decisions. According to the author, being a supercommunicator is an art, but one that can be learned with practice. He includes a few helpful hints that will come in handy in everyday situations, especially in interaction with someone you just met. Think first dates, random social exchanges, and business meetings. What's great about this book is it isn't just facts and dry advice. There are real-world examples that serve as memorable stories too. For instance, through excellent communication skills, there's a CI operative who wins over a reluctant spy, a jury member who convinces his fellow jurors to see an open and shut case in a completely different way from a new angle, and then a doctor who realizes he's not explaining diagnosis very well to his patients. And these anecdotes are what bumped it up to a 4-star read for me. The pieces of advice are practical on a small scale, but the stories about how communication can make a big difference are what sells you on actually attempting it. I highly recommend this to anyone who wants to try and connect on a more meaningful level with friends, loved ones, or coworkers. And the last book I want to talk about is After the Forest by Kel Woods. This was the first book I've abandoned in over a year, and it wasn't because I hated the book or anything. In fact, the writing was excellent, and I was all in for like the first 100 pages. It starts off with a neat premise, kind of picking up in a medieval European city several years after Hansel and Gretel escape from the witch with the gingerbread house, which you may be familiar with if you know your fairy tales. But halfway through, I realized I just wasn't in the mood for this. It was kind of a real-life retelling, or I guess advancing of this story with magic in it, but I just didn't feel it. I wasn't feeling the vibe, and life's too short to force yourself to read a book that you don't actually want to read. There you have it, my July 2024 Rewind. Let me know the best book you've enjoyed lately, or recommend something to me based on my reading tastes. See you in the comments, and happy reading.